Here with you on another Wednesday morning.
Same here, same here. And so, with that being said, what's your spiritual energy level?
It's a 10. I had to choose it this morning because we had some things going on with an elder, um, who's my significant other's parent, who's been dying for about 5 years, and things are getting tougher there. So it's kind of a low morning here. Um, but as I'm taught by my pal King, that the spiritual energy is something I can choose, not to be at the effect of it, but in fact to affect it myself. Um, so uh, so I'm operating at a 10 as we begin today.
Great, great. And then I actually feel that empathy. I empathize with you, I should say. Context, I'm dealing with something similar myself with my own mom. And so, it's reason to be at a lower than a 10. Because, like I said, you add her condition and her deterioration and preparing mentally for her transition to how the overall family is dealing with it, and with how they deal with it even brings even more anxiety and difficulties and challenges. So definitely a lot of reasons to say, and then you combine that with what's happening in the media, the news cycle, and what's been fed to us. All the reasons to choose definitely a lower number than a 10. But again, the engineer in me doesn't see any value. It's like if I choose a number less than 10, I don't get an award. It doesn't make me feel better. It doesn't
Right.
lighten the load. It's just that now my spiritual energy level suffers, which means my overall demeanor suffers and my state is going to suffer as a result.
Yep.
So I'm a 10 with you as well. So with that being said, I'll throw the mic back your way and ask you, what are you grateful for this morning?
Yeah. So I'm grateful. So even amid some low energy moments, um, at times I feel like I'm a broken record with this, but I feel increasingly grateful for the fact that I get up in the morning and I can turn a little handle and safe drinking water comes out of it. And if I want to, I can turn another handle, make it hot, and I can shower in it. I can do that whenever I want. And there's another place I can go in my house where if I've eaten well and drunk enough water where I can, you know, let the waste leave my body and then hit another handle and it disappears into either a sewer system or a septic system. Um, just really basic things like that. Uh, I was listening to somebody yesterday talking that uh, just about 2.5 billion people on the planet have access to what I just described out of 8.5 billion. So about 6 billion people don't have access to clean drinking water and more or less safe waste disposal. About 1.5 billion don't have anything like that. They don't have anything, and the others have unreliable versions of it. Um, so, that said, in many ways, even though I'm not wealthy financially, I'm among the safe drinking water, indoor plumbing elite on the planet. Not to mention refrigerated with food in it and pretty reliable, albeit expensive in Connecticut, electricity. So I'm just grateful for basic things like that, and then that I have friends like you and a lot of close friends over the years that I trust and who trust me, and just many. I want to say I almost said small blessings, but very very basic blessings that are easy to take for granted. And part of my commitment is not to ever take any of it for granted. So I'm grateful for all of that.
Great, great. I agree. I concur with you 100%. I'm also grateful for, my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, breathe, walk, talk, stand, and have sound mind. Even with the sound mind, I'm so grateful for the understanding of being able to continue to learn and understand, because there's so much information out here that I don't know, and I'm just learning. And every day just still feels great to be able to learn, and I appreciate learning so much more now than I did when I was younger. I wasn't taught the value of it. I guess that's a I don't want to say necessarily cultural given. Well, depends on how you define culture as far as geographically. It's just your neighborhood, your entire culture as your identity. So, but all that being said, grateful for mother who's still alive. I was able to talk to her today, so that still felt great. And just having people care about her and talk to those individuals and tapping into that, as I say, that friend energy, as you say, his family can be difficult to deal with. So finding those friends that you are vibrating on a frequency level, and they can be there to offer you the support. So that's my gratitude for today as well.
Yeah, beautiful.
All right. Well, without any further ado, why don't you walk us into what our topic's going to be for today's show?
Yeah, so for anybody who has been listening, today's trajectory is going to be similar but not identical to what we've been speaking about. I mean, for the past month and a half or so, we're speaking about enough with the talking points, doing more good than harm in conversation, which is based on a 2020 book of mine. And we've been noodling around with avoiding sweeping generalizations, obviously avoiding insulting people, avoiding at times misleading or overly simplified labels. I'm not saying that a label is never okay. There's times, I like having labels on food when I go to the market so I can know what's safe or what's in it. But to label people or large groups of people indiscriminately often leads to some problems. So what I want to do today is take a deep dive into, or as deep as we can go in an hour, some things we've touched on before, but there's really currently now in the U.S., and it's not brand new in the U.S., but it's really powerful now in the United States. There's a war both of and against language. That's how I would describe it. There's other ways to describe it. What I mean by that is just a couple of examples. The most current ones first, and then I'll say some that are less current, that began some years ago, but are still going on. So they're still current. So a week and a half ago, give or take, the Trump administration banned, it's over 100 words and phrases from any federal website. These words can no longer be on any federal website. And if you're an organization that gets federal funding, like major colleges and universities, you can't use these words either. And if you do, you lose your federal funding. So Columbia University just lost $400 million of federal funding, not just for the language thing, but for some other things. So the government is beginning to violate First Amendment rights. That's a simple way to say it. Right? Just saying you can't say this, this, or this. That's a blatant violation of the freedom. The government shall make no laws preventing the freedom of speech, preventing the freedom of assembly, blah, 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 blah. Freedom of the press is included as well. So that's one. The beginning of saying this language is okay, that language is not okay. And ironically, the Republican Party has been critiquing the left for some years because the left did make some missteps, I would agree with, not making laws, but criticizing people's speech, saying you shouldn't say that. You have to be politically correct. So we all remember that and we all know about that. So that's the biggest, most recent example. Right? You cannot have these words on any federal government website. I forget if I mentioned this last week, but I'm going to mention it again because it's an important story. Many of us remember June 4th, 1989, when the students in China protested against the government in China, which was a big deal. It's one thing to have students on college campuses in the United States protest. Been doing that for generations. But in China, it's a big deal because it's a dictatorship, communist country. And many of us remember the one young man with shopping bags in his hand standing directly in the path of a tank. And when the tank tried to move around him, he'd move with the tank. So eventually, 200 or 300 students got killed. Several thousand got wounded in that standoff. In China today, if you're in China and you get on the internet, which is government controlled and monitored, and you try to search for Tiananmen, which is the name of the square where it happened, nothing comes up. If you search for 1989, the year itself, nothing comes up. And if you search for June 4th, the day that it began, nothing comes up. So, I'm not saying that that's where the United States is right now, but when the government begins to limit the speech of the people, even beginning with the government's own website, because in a democracy, allegedly, the people are the government, that we elect our representatives, it's a very dangerous move. So it's been going on some time, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of a few of these, but the attacks, if you read Project 2025, it's the initial principles and summaries of it in the first, I'll say, chapter of Project 2025. It's very clear that they consider DEI, woke culture, critical race theory, intersectionality. Those are all stated literally and basically saying we're getting rid of all that. And for anybody who really understands what DEI, critical race theory, woke, and intersectionality is part of critical race theory. Anybody who really understands the history of those things, why they're there and what they do, should be concerned about that. Last thing I'll say, this is just providing the overview. Somewhere between half and 2/3 of President Trump's executive orders, which in other words, things that are getting done that don't involve Congress at all. Somewhere between half and 2/3 of those are directly from Project 2025. In other words, there weren't his ideas. They were the ideas of several hundred Christian writers and scholars who said, this is what we need to make our country a white Christian nation again. And so the Trump administration is carrying out Project 2025 every day. That's not the only thing they're doing. They're also making a lot of money for billionaires, including Trump and Musk themselves. But we want to focus on the language thing today, because dangerous things are happening for anybody who really believes in democracy by the people, for the people, and of the people. As Abraham Lincoln said at the Gettysburg Address, after several tens of thousands of Confederate and Union soldiers died on the battlefield at Gettysburg. So that's where we want to go today. The danger of losing of a government imposed censorship of language, to put it that way.
I'm going to share with you my initial thoughts and then have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So my initial thoughts are this, that I believe that what you're saying is definitely alarming and definitely worth being concerned about, absolutely. But I also think that Trump is doing the classic bait and switch. I think Trump's agenda is to do what he can to stay in power and create this this new system of how white supremacy is going to govern democracy in the United States from this point forward, and to get rid of democracy. And what's happening with the stock market, what's happening with the tariffs, he's causing all these rallies, laying all these individuals off, all those things. If he keeps throwing race out there and these issues that people are going to be triggers, things that's going to trigger people, that list of words you said, and getting rid of DI programs, and getting rid of anything woke and all those things like that, that really, at the end of the day, are just labels are just throwing out there. They trigger words. They get the news, the media, and everybody riled up around that, and you lose the real nugget of what's really happening over here. So that's my initial thought. But staying within topic, let me ask you some questions about what you outlaid. So I'm curious to know, how do labels and stereotypes about gender and sexuality limit our ability to connect authentically with each other, would you say?
Yeah, great. And I mean, I'll address it exactly as you asked it. And it's what I'm going to say about gender and sexual identity is true for race or any kind of stereotype, stereotypical language. Um, at the base level, foundationally, what happens is um, individual human beings get reduced to a label. So I no longer, let's go with the biggest bogeyman right now, which is transgender issues. So a human being who identifies other than the biological body they were born with, whether or not they've actually made a transition and gotten surgery or anything like that, but they identify other, they stop being a human being in the eyes of their critics, and they're just a trans person. And the most successful stereotyping, just to stay with the trans argument for a moment, was during the 2024 campaign, an immensely successful campaign based in lies and hyperbole was the campaign where you would see 3 or 4 young girls, young middle school to high school girls in athletic uniforms, whether they were basketball or volleyball, not important. Usually they were white. And then you would see juxtaposed, this was created either with Photoshop or artificial intelligence. You would see this Frankenstein's monster-like creature wearing a similar outfit with long hair, masculine, basically a man's face with a little bit of a dark 5 o'clock shadow on it, who was supposed to be a girl, rather a man who transitioned to become a girl, a boy transitioned to become a girl, who was now going to compete against these little girls. So this big hulking monster of a man, and it was, and Kamala Harris had come out to speak in favor of supporting trans rights, but they made it into this thing. This creature is going to be competing against your daughters in interscholastic sports. So around the nation, the number of times that's been an issue, I'm not saying you can count it on one hand, but it's a really small number, and it needs to be addressed. I mean, but it wasn't like these big men playing against these little girls. It was on some occasions some transitioned women who definitely had some biological advantages, and it was mainly on a college level. So what the ads did and what the attacks did was create this whole scenario where these people, these trans people, are taking over sports in your community, in your high schools, and in your colleges. And lost in that ad and in the language behind it was the actual human beings, whether they were the little girls who were biological girls playing sports, or the very few number of transitioned athletes. So it became a large stereotype, and it worked. People were terrified of these trans monsters, the same way they were terrified of the Haitians on the immigration thing eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio. That was a successful campaign. People believed that. All right, both of them were at best hyperbole, at worst outright lies. So that's one example. I could give you other examples of how stereotyping people, oh, he's trans or she's trans, or more appropriately, they're trans. But what does that mean? I mean, why don't you have a conversation with the human being? So that's what gets lost. It's the same mentality that subjugated women, that subjugated Native Americans, that subjugated Africans, and then African Americans. There's no difference in the patterns of thought and behavior. The only difference now is the target of who's being hurt by it. So anyway, that was. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you answered my question.
I'm not good at short answers. I know. So
Well, it's the most important is getting answers. Sometimes the answer has to be long in order to get explanation clearly stated. But it does bring some other questions up.
yeah.
Now you talk about trans being the boogeyman. I agree that anytime they really want to get like some folks, some people across racial lines, they will throw the trans out there. And like definitely that topic has definitely got a lot of people from the black community who probably wouldn't have voted Trump. It's interesting how these people can be these single issue voters. I don't understand it. I don't want to judge. I believe in judging people's behaviors, but these single issue, I voted because this person said this about abortion, or this person said this about climate change. I don't see how, with all the issues out there, somebody could be a single issue voter and make a determination based on that. But even with that being said, um, hearing in the news lately where it's Gavin Newsom, what governor's state of California is governor, interviewed Charlie Kirk, which I can't believe he would interview him to really begin his podcast initially. It's like that just really shows that he's going for maximum viewership, and he wants to try to appeal to his audience. It's the only reason you would do something like that, to say, I'm going to invite this individual on my podcast, even though we disagree politically as far as ideology, but you want to tap into his network, his base. And the topic of trans came up, and he said that he felt there should be an issue of fairness, that again, biologically woman or women. And what's surprising to me is that he was attacked for making that statement, and so much so that they ready to cancel him by saying, we're going to make sure you don't get voted in, or we're going to campaign against this one issue. We could agree with you on everything else, but because you said this, we're going to make sure you don't get in office. That to me is really a danger. It's like it's not a candidate I've seen that since I've been voting that I agree with every issue that their platform stated. But to say that they should not get voted because I just agree with them on just one of those issues like that, unless it's a blatant one, blatantly unjust and racist. I think that the whole trans thing personally still has some education to be understood around it.
Yep.
So to counsel people because they don't have that clarity on that, I think is just not realistic and fair. And it's going to create more enemies than it's going to align more people to the cause. Personally, I think there needs to be more education around it. I don't think most people can't even properly tell you what each letter in the LGBTQ stands for and why they're there. Like, so that's not just clear that everybody operates like we all have that assumption. We know what are the proper pronouns to say in certain situations and when they're used and all that. That still has to be more conversations, more education around that. So now, when we set in that context, I just want to ask this next question. And seeing yourself as a victim, what role does vulnerability play in moving beyond stereotypical thinking in our conversations? What you say?
Okay. So when you began by saying seeing yourself as a victim, and then what role does vulnerability play? Just clarify what you mean by starting off with seeing yourself as a victim. I'm not clear what you mean by that.
Well, I'm kind of equating the victim identity with also being vulnerable, to say, well, I'm going to be vulnerable in this identity. And within that context, once you identify an identity, what role does being vulnerable play in moving beyond these stereotypical thinking in our conversations?
Okay.
Like what I laid out to you about the education we need around the LGBTQ titles and labels. How do we move beyond that in our stereotypical thinking in our conversations?
Yeah, it's a big question. For me, there's so many, I'll say, components that tie in there. But let me just start off by basically defining for a second. A lot of people have a problem with the word vulnerability. It's used in different ways. Some people think of it as weakness, like men especially are, raised, boys, if you're vulnerable, you're weak. And that's not a thing you want to do if you're a boy or a man. Right? You got to be strong and tough. That's the Pete Hegseth, warrior culture stereotype, to call it what it is. Vulnerability simply means open or exposed. So I'm open to, basically exposing myself, and by exposing, being honest about myself. I'm being vulnerable. This is how and who I really am. Okay. For me, there's a divide between victimhood and vulnerability. So if I'm truly vulnerable, if I'm truly open, I'm probably not going to feel like a victim because I'm courageous enough to be myself and to be fully who I am. Even though I could be victimized by others who might attack me or make fun of me or cancel me, I don't feel like a victim because I'm in integrity for myself. So I want to just
let me further clarify what I meant. See,
yeah, I might be missing the point. Yeah.
When I'm saying the stereotypical thinking, meaning that the stereotype that someone puts on you, and I'm saying that if you accept that label, then that to me is you're accepting the victimness of that label. And then if you're going to be vulnerable within that context, that's what I see what the burden is. Not saying that vulnerability in itself is a weakness, but it's if I accept that you call me a name and I accept that name, then to me being vulnerable within that space is where I'm disagreeing with you, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I didn't understand what you were asking at the first time. So I appreciate the clarification. So based on what you just said, so if somebody calls me a name, if somebody, whatever it is, and I own it, I accept it. Oh yes, that's what I am. And because of that, in this larger culture, I'm a victim. Whether it's because I'm a woman, because I'm black, because I'm brown, because I'm gay, whatever it is, I'm a victim, and now I play the victim role. The problem inherent in that for me is that somebody who is not doing the work, and I'm going to look up at the title of our podcast, of being fully human, of doing the work to be in integrity and live a life of one's own, as opposed to what's being projected onto me. And that puts one in a very exposed, vulnerable position, but not in the sense of vulnerability as I was using it, where I'm choosing to be myself and saying, this is the truth. This is who I really am. Nobody's calling me this. This is who I really am. So that the difference between that externally projected or imposed identity and that internally grown into and owned identity is really different. And the nature of the vulnerability is going to be different depending on whether my identity is authentic or externally imposed. So am I getting closer to what you're asking?
You are. And I guess I really should just emphasize the whole, what I was really looking at was stereotypical. Like when someone labels you that way. And that's what I think people tend to be triggered by when someone can say, blacks, gays, or they just throw those labels out like that, knowing those are trigger words that's going to get people to now rally, come back at them or be defensive because they made that generalization. And I'm just saying that because I look at it as once you identify, as we talked about, fully human, I'm not as bothered by, you can't trigger me with that, especially when I see what you're doing. Like you're not gonna change my state and get me into a space of now being defensive or angry because you brought this energy towards me. So I was just asking, when people use these stereotypical labels like that and then frame that in this really biased way, being careful not to be vulnerable in that space is where I was going with that question.
Well, yeah, and my experience with that, as both my own personal experience with it, observing it and experiencing it, even though as a second generation Italian American, to paraphrase Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says, people who think they're white, and the whole history of where whiteness came from, because that's an American, invention for the most part. The people coming over from Europe didn't think of themselves as white. They were Irish, they were Italian, they were Polish, but they
Right.
didn't say, I'm a white person. Even when they met, bumped into and then enslaved Africans, they still, we were the English enslaving Africans, or we were the French, but we weren't white. Whiteness, all that. So,
Right.
I just lost my thread there. So, if just repeat the last part of what you said. Just remind me where you.
It was being the vulnerable. It was questioning vulnerability when the stereotypical label is placed upon you.
Yeah, that's a developmental thing. It's a lot easier for somebody who's been paying attention, somebody like you, I'll say somebody like me, a lot of my colleagues, your colleagues, who are a little bit have some chronology behind them, even though chronology alone is not enough. But it's really a developmental advantage where if somebody throws something at you or throws something at me, we're able to, because we are more comfortable in our own skin, because we aspire constantly towards being more fully human, to say, hey, that's their problem, that's not me. But if it happens to some 12-year-old in 7th grade, I think that's how old they are, or a 10-year-old or 16-year-old who doesn't yet have the advantages of understanding life and the world as we might, it's much easier to accept the label. So I think there's, the whole idea of me-centrism, us-centrism, all that. I come back to development a lot. If you're developmentally able to see that, oh, that's their problem, not mine, even though I'm uncomfortable in the moment when somebody's calling me this thing in public, I really know that it's not who and how I am. It's much easier to be okay with that and not identify with it. So the developmental view is going to really impact how one receives the insult or the label or the stereotype.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break for our sponsor. We're going to pick back up on the second part of our show. So I actually have a follow-up question to that, but we'll pick it up on the other side. So right now, let's hear a word from our sponsor. So we're back, and I just want to now focus back on answer my piggyback question, if you remember that. And this is really centered on stereotypes. So I just really want to flesh that out a little bit more, so that hopefully make my previous question make more sense to people in that word as well. So in your book, you discuss doing more harm than good in conversations. And my question is, what are some practical strategies for catching ourselves before we resort to stereotypes? And
Yeah.
maybe
So
in that context.
yeah. So first is to educate. I'm going to just speak in first person because it's easier rather than saying oneself, because that's not how I really talk. To educate myself in terms of what a stereotype is and understand what it is. It's a label that groups all people together as though they're the same. I mean, that's one way to describe a stereotype. And then to get familiar through self-reflection. So one is education. What is this thing? Second is familiarity through self-reflection. What are some of the stereotypes that I'm susceptible to using, that I might use? And not just to name them in conversation because they're things we're talking about, because you and I have mentioned, DEI and woke and things like that. We're just talking about the use of the stereotypes, but actually, saying, stop DEI, stop woke, and right. So what are some of the stereotypes that I'm prone to use in conversation? And when I use them, this is the self-reflective part. What do I really mean by them? So if I say, I'll use a couple of examples. So if I say stop woke, which I personally don't say, what am I really trying to stop? If I say stop MAGA, what am I really trying to stop? So in other words, I don't want to just stay with the left stereotypes. Let's just get, if I say to Hillary Clinton, when you say the deplorables, which is one of the politically, the most egregious political mistakes she made in 2016, one moment, one word, one sentence. What did you really mean by that? So education, self-reflection. Because if I have assumptions about you in conversation, you, the generic you, anybody I might talk with, and I use stereotypes based on my assumptions, I'm reducing you to a group or a class or even a caste sometimes that you may not belong to. And even if you do belong to it, I'm still reducing you to this thing, member of a group, as opposed to a living, breathing human being. So educate yourself. What is a stereotype? Self-reflect. How do I use them? And which are the ones that I'm most susceptible to using? And then, and this is the key, commit to practicing not doing that. And that's work. That's, and here's the nutshell. This might take 90 seconds, but here's basically the developmental move, how you can stop yourself from using stereotypes. So the first step is, after you've committed to trying to work on this, is you use a stereotype in a hurtful way. And right after you say it, you realize it. So it's like, oh man, I did it again. There it goes. Right? That's the first step. If you really commit and you do, you're really inside of your heart, your mind, and your gut, you don't want to keep doing that. Eventually, you'll begin to use the stereotype and you'll catch yourself in the middle of it. So rather than, oh, I did it again, there it goes, it's, oh, I'm doing it again. Let me interrupt this. I just caught myself using that label, right? So that's progress. The third step is, once I no longer do it and then only know it after I do it, I'm in the middle of catching myself doing it. And then eventually, if I keep doing the work, I get familiar with the trajectory of the conversations where I might use this stereotype, and I can see the trajectory coming. And when I'm about to use it, I catch myself before I do. And that's the place you want to be. That's the place. So you go from, oh shit, I did it again, to, oh shit, I'm doing it again, to, oh wow, I stopped myself. And you don't just do that by thinking about it. You have to practice it. You have to catch yourself. You have to do the work, and it's repetitive. You want to be a 90% foul shooter. You go to the foul line, you keep shooting, and you make sure that your technique is correct to use. That I got my St. John shirt on, so the Big East tournament starts today. So just anyway, okay. So that's one proven way to change thought and behavioral patterns. I did it again. I'm in the middle of doing it. Oh, I can prevent myself from doing it, but it takes work and commitment.
Now, and that leads to my next question, which is, you talk about cultural givens. Mm-hmm. So how might our cultural givens influence our tendency to use labels or even make sweeping generalizations?
Yeah, so early on, let me make sure this is right before I say it out loud. This is close. If this isn't 100% accurate, it's 98 or 99. Early on, our cultural givens give us all the stereotypes and labels that we use. And that's where it comes from. The worldview we're given as children is filled with stereotypes. And that's how we see the world early on. It's given by parents, teachers, people in the community, aunts, uncles, grandparents, whoever, the adults in our world. And it's our obligation to begin to examine that in late childhood, early adolescence, and throughout the rest of our lives. So early on, all of our stereotypes and labels and generalizations come from our cultural givens. So I think that's straightforward. Now, we continue to get them as we get older. The idea of MAGA, just to use that as an example, any one of them, the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, the idea of MAGA. People in my generation or your generation weren't given that in our early years. That language didn't exist yet. The issues around some of it did, but Make America Great Again, basically, which was stolen from the Reagan years, and DEI, which, the essence of that began, before America was founded, when in the pre-Declaration of Independence, but when the settlers all, had slaves already, the issues around what led to what we now call DEI were already in play. But the language wasn't there yet. So the stereotype of, stop woke or DEI or the deplorables wasn't there yet. We continue to get hit from the culture at large, even in our adulthood, and we have to keep on working at our own authenticity.
Speaking of which, how can we respectfully challenge stereotypes when we hear them without creating defensiveness or sounding defensive?
Yeah, so depending on the literal environment in which the stereotype takes place, one skill, and it has to be done skillfully, so I'll model a good way and a not so good way to do it. One way is just to ask questions. So I'm not going to go through the whole example, but I was on a podcast, I guess it was a podcast. It was during COVID, and it was around poetry therapy and the use of poetry for making the world a better place. And so a question came from the audience, and that was a Dominican woman, a Black woman, and a white guy. I was a white guy, in case you thought I was the Dominican woman. And somebody in the audience who we couldn't see basically said, I really love all of this, but how would you try to explain this to people who aren't woke? So for me, that's a trigger. Right? Because this person is dividing the world up between woke people and non-woke people, according to her view of them. And so nobody wanted to answer the question. And I don't, I'll answer any question that I think I have an answer for. So I began by saying, thank you for the question. Just to clarify, when you say woke, what exactly do you mean by that? So that's the skill right there. I mean, in this particular case, the person either was afraid to answer or chose not to, because she didn't respond. It was a young woman's voice. So then I addressed it anyway. I said, here's how I understand woke, and why I think the question itself is problematic, as though somebody who's not woke, according to you, can't understand poetry therapy. So I have a problem with that. I didn't say it quite that way. So the first step is ask a question. Somebody uses a stereotype. You ask a question. When you say MAGA, so if somebody's criticizing MAGA, and I'm not a fan of what MAGA stands for, just so we're being authentic here, but somebody uses any stereotype in a very non-threatening way. So just, I have this impression of what MAGA means, but I want to show I understand what it means when you use it. What do you mean when you say MAGA? Now, what very often happens there is a person uses a stereotype thoughtlessly or unreflectively, and they can't answer the question. Literally can't. They can't tell you what they mean when they say it. And that I've seen that happen with woke. I've seen it happen with DEI. I've seen it happen with critical race theory. I can imagine it happening with MAGA. I haven't seen that in person. but asking the question when you use that phrase, I have a sense of it, but what exactly do you mean by it? That can lead to a really good conversation, but it can also threaten somebody who's using the phrase without knowing what it means. But that's fine, because you shouldn't use phrases that you don't know what they mean. Now,
Absolutely. Exactly.
you don't want to say, what the hell do you mean by that? I could say it even worse than that, but I won't. You don't want to confront the person. But a cool way into it is, so I have an understanding of woke, in my own mind. But when you use it as you just did, what exactly do you mean? So I want to make sure we're on the same page as we continue this conversation. So you make it as non-threatening as possible. And then have the conversation. No guarantee it's going to go well. Some people are good at engaging in conversation. Some people are not. But that's a way in. Question the language in a non-threatening way.
Studying sales as I was coming up throughout my career, one of the questions that was always asked, that we were taught to ask when somebody asked a question or made a comment about a product or service we were doing, was always asked a question, by that you mean what?
Okay, yeah.
So somebody say, okay, well, this is too expensive. By that you mean what?
Yeah.
Instead of you being defensive and saying, well, no, it's not expensive. This is what you're getting. You're getting this, X, Y, and Z. No, by that you mean what? Because to your point, they can mean a variety of things.
Yeah.
It's too expensive right now. You know what I'm saying? It's too expensive for me today. It could be a lot of things. So, and then I also thought about when you explained that, this is going to date me, as far as for sure my age, but that's what Columbo was always great at. He was always great at asking those offensive questions, but did it in such a unaggressive manner, so you don't get defensive. You're forced to try to answer his question.
Yeah.
And he would always say, "Well, I just one more quick question for you."
Yeah.
And it'd be the question that was really the crux of the whole theory. He'd throw that at you as one more quick question, so he's to diffuse you, thinking like you've gotten over it, and then he hits you with the hard question. But yeah, so I thought about those two things when you just talked about being mindful of that. But that's also taken to the assumption, I would say, that people are growth minded. And this, I know you don't have an answer to this question, but I just want to get your thoughts on it. Out of the 75 million people who voted for Trump, how many would you guess, believe to be, are folks that can be held in a conversation like this, where you both can go into it with trying to understand the other person, as opposed to going in with both of y'all thinking, I got to teach this person something they're not getting about their faulty logic?
Yeah, so I wouldn't pretend to put a number to it. But I'll answer it kind of qualitatively.
Percentage,
Yeah, but I'd rather answer it qualitatively, and then if I need to, I'll put a percentage in there.
All right.
So qualitatively, and this is my hope, more than most people would imagine, more than most people who voted for Kamala Harris would imagine. I think there are more people who would be open to that conversation. I say that for a couple of reasons. I could say half. That would be a complete. I don't really know. 50%, 75%. But two things inform my response. One is, it gets back to development. The people who are only concerned with me-centrism, how everything affects me or my group, they're less likely to engage in that conversation because they're in protection mode. They're protecting either themselves, which is where Donald Trump lives, or they're protecting, their group. All right, so they're less likely. But people who are, for whatever reason, voted for Donald Trump, maybe for economic reasons, they believed everything he said, maybe because they were just so tired of the left accusing them of not being woke. There was really a lot of unskillful things going on the left that insulted a lot of people. But they really do believe that all human beings should have a right to life and happiness and pursuit of happiness. They really do believe that, even though they voted for him. They're more likely, if they really care about all humans, they'd be more likely to be open to it. And I have one experience I had really quickly that speaks directly to that, is when Healing America's Narratives came out, when the book came out in 2022. The one time in my life I paid a publicist, which I'll never do again. I paid him a little bit, but it was still too much, to get radio gigs and everything. And he got me, one gig in New York City, but it was a small kind of like streaming service. It wasn't even a real radio station. And then he got me like 4 gigs in AM radio around the country. One was in Michigan, one was in Texas, one was in North Carolina, and they were all small conservative AM radio stations, talk radio stations. Not the particular market for my book. And with only one exception, and these people hadn't read the book, even though I sent them copies of it. It's 500 pages. They didn't have time to read it, but they skimmed through it with almost no exceptions. With one exception, I should say. They asked me good questions. They asked me some pointed questions about the link between Chinese and Hunter Biden and the laptop and that kind of shit, which I said, I don't know anything about that. I just wouldn't, I wasn't going to bite on that at all. But 3 of them basically said, so it sounds to me, he sounded kind of confused, but he was listening. He said, it sounds to me like you have some values that could be considered both liberal and conservative, that you're not just out here saying one thing. I said, well, in fairness, I don't think Donald Trump is a good guy, but I don't think that either the left or the right has all the answers. So yeah, you're assessing me correctly. So I was actually pleasantly surprised by those interactions, that they listened enough to what I was saying to be able to say, wow, that sounds like that you're not stuck in one place or the other. I said, yeah, I'm not. Other than I have no problem saying I'm against Donald Trump, because I've known who he is since about 1978 or so. And I didn't like him then. I've never liked him, and I still don't like him. So I think that there are probably more people than we might imagine. Some of them are only going to begin to see what you and I are talking about when they personally get hurt by what's going on. When they feel victimized by a stereotype or by an economic policy or by whatever, when it hits them in their own heart or in their own home, then that's where the me-centric or us-centric people can say, oh, this isn't fair to me. But there are plenty of people, conservative and liberal, who are able to look out at the world and say, even though it isn't directly affecting me, I can see that other people are suffering and I care about that. So that's the place where you can have these conversations more easily. Some people need direct experience to grow. Some people can kind of see other people's experiences and grow through that. Did I make sense there?
You did. I would say that you're more hopeful than I am. But see, I also asked that question because it helps me to understand, like if I meet individuals on the street, I guess it's the engineer in me. I'm always going to put some kind of number to it. So, like, for example, what I mean by that, if I see someone wearing a Nazi hat, Proud Boys, or whatever, right, and they're displaying it proudly, I'm thinking 100% of the time, him and I'm not going to agree if we try to get into a conversation. And there's 100% chance that we're not going to have a productive conversation if we engage in it, whatever. Whether it was a shouting match or a sit down coffee break, we're not gonna sway each other thinking at all, 100%. And now if I see somebody with a mega red hat on, I'm pretty much thinking the same thing, especially now. Like I can get maybe in 2016, 2017, 2018, I can get, I believe that maybe there can be a conversation to be had that we can see eye to eye. But what's going on right now in the country, if you are okay with Trump's blatant stealing from the country, lying, and Fox News lying, and it's blatant now. It's like it's not even a label; it's just facts, and you still stand firm and like, well, no, I'm gonna hold true to that party, it's 100% chance that you and I are not going to have any valuable conversation. So that's why I asked you the question. Were you similar in my thoughts? I just kind of want to set the context. But as we get ready to wrap up, I want to, focus on giving some folks some next steps. And I have a question I want to ask leading to that before you get into that, which is, let's talk about healing now. What healing might be possible both individually and collectively when we move beyond stereotypical thinking about gender and sexuality.
Yeah, so I just want to define healing quickly. The way we've been using it is healing. The first step in healing is coming to terms with things as they are. So if you don't accept what's really happening, if you don't do the work of getting to the truth, or at least being truthful, that's doing your best, even if you can't find a final truth somewhere. If you don't do that, nothing gets healed. It doesn't happen. I don't care if you break your arm, make believe it's not broken. It's never going to heal. All right. Make believe that stereotypical language doesn't hurt people. The healing can't take place. So the first step is coming to terms with the truth of the damage that stereotypes do. Period. They limit they denigrate, they limit the existence of a discrete human being. And until you come to terms with that being true, that's what happens. The healing isn't possible.
All right. Well, you want to give us some steps on how we can be more mindful in our conversations and not make sweeping generalizations or labels?
So I'm going to kind of piggyback on what I said earlier, because this is similar to the question you asked me earlier, but it's first educating myself about what a stereotype is and the damage it does, it can do. Familiarizing myself through self-reflection on the stereotypes that I use, the language of stereotype that I use, generalizations, labels, and getting clear on why I do that is helpful. And then catching myself doing it. And again, the first step is always going to be catch myself right after I did it. Oh, I did it again. If I do enough practice, catch myself in the middle of doing it. Oh, I'm in the process of using that stereotype again. And then the progressive step, if you really practice, is you watch the trajectory of when you usually use those stereotypes and you catch yourself before you do it. That's a real thumbnail approach, which takes some time to really practice, but it works. I'm not just making up a theory, but it requires practice. So that's what I would recommend. Commit to catching yourself using stereotypical language, and then practice and practice and practice.
All right. So we got that as our follow-up action steps that we can take into next week. Be mindful of what you say, you be self-aware, and then practice once you begin to catch yourself to the point where it becomes habit, right? It becomes automatic that you actually feel that bias coming up, feel those stereotypical thoughts coming into your mind. And I just want to add, and try to get to know someone from that side that you, again, this is for the folks who are growth-minded and want to learn, obviously. If you already know all the answers, then nothing we're saying is going to appeal to you at all. But someone who's looking for growth-mindedness, looking for some peace of mind and soundness, and how to begin to build consensus relationships with people who may not necessarily think like you think, that's our target audience for this messaging. And with that being said, I want to shift into our next final segment of our show, which we highlight someone who is past or present, who has exhibited behaviors that were consistent with being fully human. Not that they were perfect, not that everything they did in their lives were perfect or even said was perfect. And that's really the point of being fully human. You're not perfect. You're not ever going to be perfect, but you grow and you don't make the same mistakes you've made before as you gain the wisdom and knowledge. And that's where being fully human comes in for me. I like to use it as my identity. I identify as fully human, so I'm not taking on the stereotypical biases of that identity that may come from being my race, or being my gender, or being my age, or being whatever the label you want to give me. So, with that being said, the person I'm going to choose that I believe exhibits the fully human, the side of compassion, showing love. And again, I know I'm repeating myself with some of the people or this person I'm going to say. I definitely know I said them before, but they come to my mind because they're top of mind. I see examples recently of this person and just kind of really wishing that we still had this kind of energy today. This is someone who's passed. Um, Again, and that's no, actually, I never said this person's name. Now I think about it. Bill Withers, the artist, the singer, Bill Withers, and he wrote the song and sang the songs "Lean on Me," "Grandma's Hands," um, "Who Is He" and "What Is He to You," songs like that. But the songs that were really just, and I heard the song this morning when I was going through my reflection, was "Lean on Me," and the words were just really so profound, and the melody of that song, and it's like how what's became so blatant to me is how there's no songs like that being played nowadays on the radio. And let me put the caveat: I don't listen to the radio, so I could be completely wrong if there are. But one of the reasons I don't listen to the radio is because I believe that they don't play those kind of songs. At least that's never gets played at the Grammy shows or whatever. And just how powerful it was to have somebody that you would have in your network to say, "Lean on me. When you're not strong, I'll be here for you." I don't know the complete words, but just having that kind of kindness and love and desire to be there for you and seeing the humanity in you for them demonstrates the humanity in themselves. So just want to lift up Bill Withers for writing those kind of songs, songs that are timeless, songs that they take you back and think about love. And the song "Grandma Hands" obviously reminds me of my mother, and just having that matriarchal love and nurturing person in your life, and how just her hands was something you remember because the strength she had with the food she prepared or took care of you. You just remember that. So Bill Withers for today for me.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I love that song. Actually, the group, the international group of folks, I think it's called, is it Music for Change? I'm getting it wrong. They do a great version of it. They do a lot of different covers of songs, and they have people on every continent playing music, and they mix it all together. But they do a really nice version of that. Not that there's anything wrong with Bill Withers' original version, but it's so I'm gonna try to just share the screen really quickly here. Yeah, I think I can do this the right way. So I'm going to mention, this is my stepson. I'm going to use Noe Jimenez is his name. And we had dinner a couple of nights ago. It's a great old diner, like huge diner. It's open 24 hours, right? Like it's at the intersection of right off the exit at Interstate 84, exit 10 in Newtown, Connecticut. It's really, just an old-fashioned huge diner, which we like going to. And we hadn't done that in a while, so we had just this great conversation. He's 35 now, so we were joking about his being, he's now half my age. Back when I first met him, he was 7.5, and I was whatever, 40 something. So I say he's catching up, gradually. But just a good guy. He's a visual artist, sensitive soul. And every time I'm with him, we just have a great, great time and a great conversation. We didn't talk too much about politics, which I was, we were both glad about. But we are able to do that on a pretty regular basis. So I'm actually not exactly sure how to stop sharing the screen here now. Got it. So that's Noe Jimenez, 35 years old, artist, arts administrator, gallery director at a state community college in Connecticut, and just guy that I love.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that. I was looking at that picture, and I looked at that parking lot diner, and I'm thinking, like, that's where you and I met And that, I know that's not the same location, but it
Yeah.
looks like it could be the exact same location, you know. And I was thinking, like, you really do like diners. You told me you did. I just confirmed it. So
Yeah.
you have your most important meetings at your diners.
Yeah, and I tell you, there aren't a lot. Even though there's a lot of diners around here in New York, Connecticut, but this one is like this. It's huge. I mean, I don't know how many people it holds. The portions are too big for me nowadays, as diner portions usually are. But it's one of the few that are still open 24 hours, and it's right on and off I-84. So it's, trucks like it, truckers like it. They bake a lot of
That's
their
silver.
own.
That's not Silver Diner, is it?
No, it's actually it's privately owned.
Oh,
It's
okay.
it's called the Blue Colony Diner. It's in Newtown, Connecticut. But it's a classic, and they bake their own challah bread and desserts and things, and it's just the best. Like, I'm salivating just talking about it now. I want to go eat food. And you can get anything you can imagine they have. I'm not anything, but it's one of those menus that you need to like work out before you go, just to lift the menu up, because I mean, the breakfast menu is 2 pages. Then there's lunch, there's sandwiches, there's entrees, there's drinks, there's desserts. It's just crazy. But I've never had a bad meal there. So
All right. Well, thanks for sharing. And as we wrap up our show for today, this has been the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King. And again, this is Reggie. And Reggie, I want to thank you again for, again, choosing a topic, being present, being engaged, bringing a 10 to the conversation. And again, I know, folks, it's challenging to be a 10. I ask this question every single time I do a podcast or have a meeting or a Zoom call with folks. And most people don't want to be a 10. They think it sounds like you're being perfect. And I get that. I can get how, our culture of givens has taught us that you never want to sound like everything's great. But in doing so, once you really understand the context, most people agree that there are 10s. And 10 allows us to do a wonderful show that we've had. I hope you all have enjoyed it, whether you've listened to it live or you listen to it as a replay. Until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., let's all continue to look for ways we can all be more fully human in our lives. Thank you.